Hi there, everyone. Welcome to this webinar run by Tracy, Professionals and Researchers in Early Childhood Intervention. My name is Tim Moore, and I'm a member of the board of Tracy. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, the Boonwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and the traditional owners of all the lands that you are all on. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining the webinar today. I also acknowledge that these lands were never ceded and recognise the ongoing connections that our First Nations people have with their land. So this webinar is produced by Tracy, Professionals and Researchers in Early Childhood Intervention, which is an organisation that is leading Australian early childhood intervention research, knowledge and translation, bridging the gap between research and practice. If you're not already familiar with our website, then we urge you to go on and to subscribe to the newsletter. We've got a couple of important events coming up that you might be interested in. If you're in Perth, there's a two-day workshop on the 23rd, 24th of April with Mary Louise Hemeter on the pyramid model. And if you can make it to the Gold Coast, if you're already booked, then we have our second national conference coming up on the 2nd and 3rd of May with pre-conference workshops on the 1st of May. So to our topic, the lead practitioners and their teams. This is of interest to us in Australia right at the moment because under the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the previous best practice that we had hit upon of having a key worker was greatly undermined for a variety of reasons, one of them being the lack of a line item for teamwork on NDIS budget items. Now, the NDIS review has recommended that early childhood intervention services be guided by a lead practitioner funded from participant budgets. And the definition they offer is an allied health, developmental, or early childhood educator who is the main professional working with the family. They help coordinate the team around the child, provide information and advice, emotional support, identify and address needs, and support the family to develop self-advocacy skills. That's what's recommended in the review. We are yet to hear what exactly the Department of Social Services will adopt of those recommendations, but we live in hope. To discuss lead practitioners, we have with us three speakers. Our main speaker is Professor Mary Beth Bruder, who is should be well known to many people in the early childhood intervention field. She has been a practitioner in the field for 40 years and is the current chair of the International Association for Early Intervention and editor of the Journal of Early Intervention. And I'm going to hand over to Mary Beth. Welcome. She is online from Connecticut. Mary Beth, you're on mute.
You would think after having so many years of doing this that we would have our little checklist ready. I apologize. And I want to thank Tim and the rest of the folks from this wonderful organization that is providing so much professional development and research to practice information to those of you in Australia. I'm going to take just a little bit of time at the beginning of this webinar to kind of remind us about why teaming is so important and what are some of the components that we have to have in place. And I would just correct Tim on one thing. I am almost in the field 50 years. I actually started teaching preschool special ed in 1976 when our federal law, it was the first year our federal law was in practice. So I've been very lucky to grow up with the field and very lucky to be taught by some of the best minds and researchers. So I'm going to be sharing with you what I have learned. And most importantly, what I've learned from families and the children who happen to be eligible for early intervention. Most of my presentation is more generic than specific to United States, but there might be something that pops in, but I'm going to try and make it more generic to everybody because Australia has such a good system already in place that really replicates and probably in some places even preceded what we've done in the United States. So let's see what I can do to move. We have had such problems there. This is just my contact information, but I'm going to start off with what do we know? What do we know about the field of early childhood intervention, which I define as services and supports for children under the age of 5 who have a discrepancy in what they are doing developmentally and behaviorally versus their chronological age and their families. And the one thing we know that I did not put on a slide is that these children and families come in all shapes and sizes. We serve a heterogeneous group, not just by disability level and characteristic, but also by background characteristics from ethnicity, race, linguistic background, socioeconomic status, and any other characteristic a family self-identifies with. But let's talk about what we know about the field. We know that the roots and the foundation of our field is multidisciplinary. It actually started through early childhood education, that is education for young children, which in the 1800s began with public kindergartens in Germany. And then subsequently, we had a variety of different models. Maria Montessori started her work with children with mental retardation, as it was called then, in the early 1900s. But mostly people were focused on this new field called early childhood and providing supports and services for education of children at a very young age. Then we had a focus on health, because health is the foundation, in my mind, of any kind of development. And the Maternal and Child Health Bureau, this is idiosyncratic to the United States. Our Maternal and Child Health Bureau started in the early 1930s by providing supports to children and their mothers in particular, to make sure that children had nutrition and any other experiences that would enhance their development. And then special ed, which also started in the mid-1800s, with a variety of different experiments initially, looking at how people learn and how children learn in particular. So when you take all three of these, the first thing we need to acknowledge is they all are separate disciplines, but they all had the same focus, which is how do we enhance development in children who may have risk conditions or may actually have disabilities. But what else do we know? We know that the science of learning is influencing our practice currently. And it also has really influenced the way we look at the vulnerabilities of the brain, which actually can be impacted by everything from environmental, and we call them, as some of you know, ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences, but also biological influences, such as nutrition, as I mentioned before. But we also know the brain is very adaptable, and positive experiences really enhance learning. So our job in our field is to minimize those negative vulnerabilities, and we want to help children become adaptable and resilient. And sometimes some of our practices, in fact, can be harmful. I'll be happy to talk about that another time. So what's the third thing we know? Early childhood intervention is complex. It's not one size fits all. It is not one type of discipline is good for every child. And it certainly isn't that a family has to fit into something that we have developed. And in fact, without going into this too in depth, this is Mike Gorelnik's development, which I think his reference is way down on my blue thing, developmental systems, which talks about starting a child and a family into a system that primarily starts with universal screening and then goes into a comprehensive interdisciplinary assessment. Interdisciplinary is the language of the law that we have in the United States, but it means multiple disciplines. and then moving a child into an early intervention program or a monitoring, doing more assessors, and then providing opportunities for families to access resources, social supports, informations. And then we primarily develop our goals and objectives, and we have evaluations until transition. That's complex. There's not one discipline that I would say can do all things. We cannot do all things to all children and families, especially when you look at the places in which children and families are spending time. In the communities, we have childcare, both private and public. We have federal programs, these are United States specific. At the preschool level, we have the same thing, childcare, private nursery schools, public pre-K programs, federal programs. Which means as we look at the complexity of early intervention and we embed it over our wonderful Bronfenbrenner schemes, we see that there's so much, you can say, influence over a child and family, or you can say there's so much noise in what we're trying to do, that we have to be very clear about our role as an early childhood interventionist and how we enhance that brain. If you look at this and there is not a systemic approach to it, it is going to harm some vulnerable brains because we have multiple different agencies and personnel that children and family could interact with. And the one thing we do know from the childcare literature is what enhances a child outcome is a stable caregiving environment. So that means stable. Stability means the same personnel who are working and not passing a child off every couple of months or even years. So we really do want to look at how do we enhance what we know, which is the science of learning within the complexity that we have in a multidisciplinary system. So how do we do this? The first thing we need to acknowledge is what are our child and family outcomes? I'm using, again, a United States scheme, which is not domain dependent. It's not OT and let's say fine motor and gross motor and communication and cognitive. It's really looking at how do children participate in their own learning in everyday activities and routines. So we look at this as how are we going to get children there, knowing the noise and the complexity. And especially if we want these outcomes, we've got to think about what's the role of personnel. So if the child and family outcomes, and I did not put family outcomes up there because of this session, it's there the dependent variables that we're measuring to see if early childhood intervention made a difference. Where do we fit in as personnel? Are we the independent variable? Are we the intervention? Or are we what we're going to measure? And then if you get even more complex, are we the mediator or even the moderator? Or of course, we're all of the above, which makes the complexity even harder. Because the conclusion is personnel can either have a powerful impact or not. And I take it to that wonderful brain that's growing. We can either enhance that development, or if we don't have a well-trained workforce, we can hinder them. Let's talk about the workforce quickly. These are the very global grouping, okay? And this is again, specific to United States. Early intervention is birth to 3, early childhood special ed is 3 to 5. And then you can break that down to related service providers, which are usually the therapists or teachers. And in our law, which is United States, we have all of these providers that can provide the supports and services under our law for early childhood intervention. But what's the challenge? All of the different disciplines differ by, at a minimum, these variables. Depending on where the discipline comes out of, whether it's a health led discipline or whether it's an education discipline or even a social service discipline like a social worker. You're going to have a philosophy that differs. Funding sources differ. Staff qualifications and licensure in the United States, we call it personnel standards, but then each state does its own licensure or certification. Staffing models, adult-child ratio, settings, involvement, what the belief is of family involvement, the curriculum focus that's used, and then what are people measuring? So all of this complexity just causes, again, us to take a breath and think, are we really doing the best thing for kids and their families? Because our effectiveness and impact depends on the philosophy, the attitude, and the beliefs of each one of the personnel in the workforce, the knowledge they have about early childhood intervention, and the skill level they bring to the intervention. And here's where we come up together in teaming, bringing people together. Now, when you go back, just bear with me, to all of these different variables that differ, the challenge is, how do we get people to listen to each other and to not get into the situation where they think their discipline knows best for this child? Or even worse, people who are on a team who don't have the training they need to understand the complexity of human development. We have lots of opportunities to be teams, but are we really teaming for the benefit of a child? Looking specifically at the definition, which is a true team, is a group of people working together and sharing a common philosophy and a common goal, starting with that philosophy. So if you have different interventionists who are coming from a background which we train them, meaning when you look at the higher education curriculum, which we have here in the States, we see that there's very little overlap about what people are learning. Most people are learning a discipline that focuses on a developmental domain. And if they're lucky, they get an opportunity in their clinical or practicum to listen to another discipline. But many times we then expect everybody to just magically be able to work together on the common philosophy and goal. And we have multiple team models. We have the multidisciplinary, which is traditionally when different disciplines just do their own thing. And interdisciplinary, different disciplines do their own thing, but then come together. And then this transdisciplinary, which has been used most recently under the guise of primary provider model. But transdisciplinary was founded in 1976, the same year I was started teaching. And it influenced, it was founded by the United Cerebral Palsy in a demonstration project they had. They published a staff book on how to do it. And the reason they did it this way was because they felt when you had different people coming from different philosophies, different foci in looking at what a child needed, and you were expecting the parent to integrate it, it was overwhelming and probably harmful. So the transdisciplinary model was initially established for young children with severe disabilities who did require the expertise of multiple disciplines focusing on different domains. It is still, in my mind, in early childhood intervention, the best because we do not need multiple people in and out of a family's home or in and out of a classroom doing their own thing. And in the States, that's still what happens. So we might have a therapist come into a classroom and pull a child out, or go into a corner in a classroom, or in a family, a different person comes on Tuesday and a different person comes on Thursday. And if we don't have the funding, which, you know, hearing what Tim was saying, which I'm optimistic too for Australia, we need funding to teach people how to listen to each other and look at the benefit, the common goal being the child and the family. I, being as ancient as I am, that's how we started. That's how I learned everything I know, is by my OT and my PT and my speech person working with me to integrate a program and looking at who's the best one to translate that. In the classroom, it was the teacher, and at home, it's the family. No matter what the family skill level is, to figure out what we can do, but not confuse the family, because we have confusing models of how we train different personnel. So this brings us to, how do we do this? And there are multiple factors that affect team process that really shows, remember my complexity of early childhood, this is complex. If you're going to be doing a team process the right way, you need to have the right composition and representation. Unfortunately, in my country, we now say a team can be 2 people. That's great if you have 2 people who have the background of working on a team, so can make some decisions, especially during the assessment process. But usually a team is the disciplines that are necessary to look at development in a holistic point of view. doesn't mean a child needs to see every member of a team, but that team needs to be able to educate each other. The team goals in terms of what are we doing? Some people are going in with their discipline and saying, I'm going to do an eval in this domain or this area, and then I'm going to tell you what the child needs. Instead of understanding some of the foundational beliefs that we have in family-centered practice. But we also need to build ownership. We need to define our roles, and mostly we need leaders who can step in to this model where we want to look specifically at the child. I'm going to skip the next one. I'm going to stick the next two. Division for Early Childhood, which some of you know about, the International Division for Early Childhood for the Council for Exceptional Children, which I hope you all take a chance to join, has recommended practices from way back when, 1992. And these practices focus on teaming as one of them. And basically from way back when, the belief is that teams include the family members and they make decisions together with the family and all disciplines. That professionals cross discipline boundaries. A lot of the writing in the early 1980s was about role release, which meant I, as a special educator, don't need to go in just as a special educator, because a special educator needs to know enough about motor to be able to position that child right. A physical therapist needs to know enough about behavior and using reinforcement models to help that child learn. You need to be able to cross those boundaries. We look at intervention on function, not just its OT time and PT time, but what does the child need to know and learn? And then the regular caregivers and regular routines provide the most appropriate opportunities for children's learning, embedding them, which also is a model that came out of the 70s for kids with children with severe disabilities, in how to embed instruction across activities and tasks. So this again shows us that our history in our field has given us the foundation of how we take that complexity and turn it into service delivery models. More recently, the DEC actually has put personnel standards together, one of which is collaboration and teaming. So candidates apply model skills, processing and teaming when collaborating, communicating, using culturally linguistic, but it talks about teaming model skills and processes, including the use of technology, multiple disciplines and roles, variety of collaborative strategies, which include communication and partnering with families. That is out there. That is our aspiration, that every discipline that is being trained at a higher ed is learning to do these things. Because mainly the one thing you need to know and have known is that learning occurs in everyday planned, that specific interventions and unplanned activities with families, friends, and others in children's lives. So we need to take advantage of what we know, take that complex models that we have and the way we're domain specific, and make it functional for us as practitioners and those who are organizing programs. Lastly, I had a project that's called the Early Childhood Personnel Center for 12 years, where we provided technical assistance to states in higher education. And one of the things that had happened through another research project I had about 20 years ago was working with our discipline-specific organizations, AOTA, APTA, ASHA, Speech and Hearing, 0 to 3, NAEYC, National Association of Education of Young Children, DEC, CEC, and I might have forgotten one or two. And we came together and everybody said, no, we can't really cross discipline boundaries because we are practice standards. It took us about 8 years to the point where we were able to do a process that took about another 4 years to actually get each of these disciplines to identify what is common across all of us. These became a set of family-centered competencies that use evidence, collaboration, and professionalism. And each of the boards of these disciplines adopted them as competencies for those in whatever discipline serving children birth to 5. And as an example, these are on our website, so I'm not going to go through them. We came up to consensus on what the definition of family-centered was, and then a whole lot of indicators that can be used as a checklist, can be used for training, but basically saying an OT and a PT and a speech and a teacher all need to be able to, example, identify the family's strengths, needs, and concerns and priorities in collaboration with the family. Prepare a family to participate. All the disciplines own this. How to do coordination and collaboration. Again, there's a definition, and we have a set of indicators that you are able to do this. Demonstrate leaderships at meetings with service providers. How to facilitate a team so that we don't ignore that. Evidence-based interventions, and the definition was somewhat generic, but are very specific, looks at both the evidence-based within a discipline and also what is necessary in early intervention. And then lastly, professionalism and ethics, so that we are doing what we know works as opposed to doing things just because we have too many kids on our caseload and we're trying to get through the day. It's what works. How do we use advocacy? And as an example, what's happening in Australia with looking again at how to bring teams back, that's what we want all of our field to be able to do. This is on a website where you can get into, there's lots and lots of tools, but the nice thing about the cross-disciplinary resources, besides the indicators, we had a number of case studies that are annotated that actually break down some of the indicators. And here's the example. It gives you discussions and resources. So it really is a nice user's guide for that. So I'm going to end right there with a picture of a nice team. That's actually one of the teams that I was able to have in one of my projects, where we discuss children every week, which is a luxury in these days, but I hope it's aspirational for us all. So I will stop sharing, and I think Denise, you're up.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary Beth. There's a huge amount in that, and I think people will definitely be wanting to know about and follow up with that website. Okay, we're now going to hear from two different perspectives, Australian perspectives. Following that, we will have opportunity for questions. If you've got any questions, use the chat function, because we will be able to ask Mary Beth and our two Australian speakers any questions that you have. So I'm going to pass now to Denise Luscombe, who is chair of the Pracy board and should be well known to all of you, to talk about the lead practitioner team around the child in Western Australia. Denise.
Thanks, Tim, and hi, everybody. So thanks, Mary Beth, for covering that history. I've also grown up with the field, I feel. So what I'll show is also some history here in WA, but basically going to talk about a WA state government service that unfortunately is no longer being provided, but I think it's still useful to reflect on the process of development that we went through. And I know that there's people online who are also intimately involved in the development and implementation of the model, so please feel free to add any comments into the chat. I'll also put a paper into the chat that covers this background and context for those who'd like more information, but really just wanted to skip through things very briefly. As Mary Beth's already talked about, we moved from a multidisciplinary team structure. Now, services in WA are divided under health, education, and disability, and disability services has historically provided services in the home and community settings, and this has been since the 70s. So we were familiar with working in homes. But we went from a multidisciplinary team structure, multiple visits, multiple programs, multiple people, etc., as Mary Beth described, around the end of the 90s. Because of new research that was coming out, we moved to a model of family-centred practice and interdisciplinary practice. So the reason we've moved our model over time has been based on the research that's coming out and wanting the best outcomes for the children and families that we're working with. In the early 2000s, I was a part of a small team that trialled a transdisciplinary model, but look, it was based on our understanding or interpretation of role release, and really it was done from a discipline lens, which Mary Beth has already talked about as being not the way to go. So we learned a lot from that. It wasn't successful, and we kept moving forwards. I had the opportunity to do a couple of scholarship tours to observe the forms of teamwork in practice over in the US, Canada, and UK. And this really demonstrated the challenges, but also what we needed to put into place to make this work. The Disability Service Commission then had a strong, and does have a strong focus on inclusion, and the outcomes for children focused on independence and participation. We put in a proposal to the Director General to change the way that our services were delivered, and the TAC model was basically developed. We were given 18 months to develop the model, to develop all the resources, processes, training, induction that was required to try to make this model as successful as possible. So WA has mainly an allied health professional workforce. And so in the team around the child, they're allocated a team of professionals with one allocated as a key contact, which was our term for a key worker. You can see the family is intimately involved in the team, and others involved can include educators, paediatricians, sports coaches, etc. So that can be as large or as small as required to meet the needs of the child. So focusing on the role of the key worker, it was to develop a relationship and work in partnership with the family, to develop a holistic picture of the child and family. There's also a coordination aspect to their role. This is internal coordination and external coordination. And then there was the key service provider role. So they and all team members were responsible for implementing the key practices that had been identified for the TAC model. And this slide shows those practices. I'm not going to go through them in too much detail, but I don't believe you can consider the role of the key worker in isolation, which is that grey line there, integrated services and supports, without understanding the other practices that support the key worker in their role and therefore the outcomes as well for children and families. So the key worker, as well as being an important part of the team, is obviously the rest of the team. So we very quickly recognised that we needed to develop guidelines as well for the team members who were supporting the key worker and the family. So they require a team who they can pull on. And it's important to say that we are not only key workers, obviously, for many children, but we're also team members for many more. So we have a responsibility to those children. So we had some key responsibilities: communication, collaboration through meetings, etc., joint visits, and the ability to coach the key worker, family and others who were working with the child and family. And then again, importantly, the discipline-specific knowledge and expertise that we needed to support the key worker. And we would do individual visits without the key worker present, but they always had the knowledge and of what we were doing and why we were doing it. So, for example, if I needed to go in and do equipment prescription or serial casting, then that's a discipline-specific need, but the key worker understood what was happening. So the key learnings, last slide really. You need a team. You can't be a key worker without a team behind you, because it's the team as a whole who supports the child and family achieve the outcomes, not just the key worker. So I feel that guidelines are needed to be clear when you need to pull in your team members for their family. Team members need to know the child and family. When we had challenges, it was often when a team member hadn't actually got to see the child or meet the family. And so to me, it's a red flag if the family doesn't know the members of their child's team, but obviously when using a key worker model. The other thing is, this is not an easy model. I think Mary Beth has already mentioned that. Working in this model requires a good understanding of not only early childhood intervention practices, but your own discipline-specific skills are required. It is not a generalist role or model of service delivery. You need those specific skills to effectively support the children that you are the key worker for, as well as the team that you are supporting as a team member. Time The other thing, it works best from a routine and activity-based lens. With many of the services that I have been involved with and supported, I have found the only truly successful key worker models have not been those that work from a discipline-specific lens, but those that work from a routines and an activity-based lens, because no routine or activity belongs to any one discipline. We need time, and the last key point is that we need consistency so that there's understanding of implementation by everybody who is involved with that family to reduce confusion and again, support consistency and application. I'll just leave this, I won't say anything about it. These are just the training topics that we covered. That'll be in the PowerPoint. I think I did it a little bit over time of 5 minutes, but if you would like any resources or have any questions, then please feel free to contact me. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Denise. One example of great work taking place over a considerable period of time on the key worker model. Our second Australian speaker is John Forster, who is the CEO of Noah's Ark in Victoria and a fellow member of the board of PRACY, to talk about Noah's Ark's experience of the key worker model. John.
Hi, Tim. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to take a slightly different tack and take you rapidly, given the time, through our journey in the 2000s, early 2000s, in terms of developing what we called a key worker role, and it led to the publication of a resource which started to sort of characterize some of the components of that. I need to slow down. So I wanted to start off contextually, because I think one of the things when Denise and I talked about this was that the experiences in our different states and territories is very different. And one of the things which we still need to be conscious of is developing common language and common understandings about terms like lead practitioners and a whole range of other things. I think the next thing is that we've always had this tension between what I'm calling outpatients and community-based models of services for young children. In terms of outpatients, it's a sort of a patient-centered approach. And in terms of community-based models, I think we're looking at some of Mike Grelnick's work, which is a really great example of how to think about that. But it's dealing with both the issues of the individual child, but more broadly thinking about parenting and inclusion and those sorts of issues. And Noah's Ark certainly came from a community-based approach. In Victoria, there were services which came into early intervention from different backgrounds, but by the 2000s, there was an anticipation that all services were basically interdisciplinary teams, or made up of teams of people from different backgrounds. And Noah's Ark had emerged in 1971, so it was a very early service, and it was set up by families. So our focus has always had this very strong interest in terms of what's happening for families and parents and parenting and community inclusion. So in the early 2000s, we had a turning point because we've basically been offering centre-based services, which in the language of the day was safe havens, and we were also supporting inclusion in childcare. And then actually under Mary Beth's influence, she came out to a conference and talked about working in natural environments. Then there was a push that we would go and do home visiting, and really we then had to really trial that, because we didn't particularly have a strong history in terms of doing that, though we talked to other services who were in a similar position. We, in retrospect, ambitiously started in our western suburbs which is the low socioeconomic part of Melbourne. And what happened was there was a real cultural shock for many therapists going into homes and really realizing the conditions under which families were raising their children. The other thing which happened was that in the comfort of their own homes, parents started talking about a whole range of issues that they weren't talking about or hadn't talked about in professional settings. And our work around the key worker was really starting to think about how we managed that range of issues. And so when we started talking about a key worker role, then we were breaking down into the different components of what that meant. And so the components here are the emotional support. So families go through very different emotional reactions to having a child with a disability, deal with different cultural reactions and so forth. So there was an issue about how do you engage and support families? In terms of information and advice, it's an incredibly confusing time for families as they're suddenly having to learn a whole lot of jargon which they'd never heard before. They're dealing with different professional priorities and trying to work out how you fit all of this into what is generally a very busy life in raising young children. In terms of identifying and addressing needs, the conversations were around things like the different priorities and resources that families had, and what having someone to sort of reflect and talk through with families how they resituated themselves in terms of working with children with disabilities was important. Advocacy becomes an issue as families start to think about going to childcare and experienced subtle and not so subtle forms of discrimination. So that's another adjustment that parents are coming through, having to deal with. And then finally, service coordination. And service coordination is important both internally within the team, but also because many families had lots of services involved or could have lots of services involved. And so it was interesting to come back and touch base about these components because these are the components that have been picked up under the NDIS review in terms of what they're talking about as the lead practitioner. And I guess one of the things that I wanted to stress was that in terms of our notion of this role, it was very much embedded in a team. And so the language around key worker was something which we developed because we've been talking about services coordination and services coordinator. We were looking for a different language. And this was a language around it being the person being the key contact with the family, somebody who was going to do the most of the home visiting, being a key therapist. So they were actually delivering most of the services well, whether they were coming from a teaching or therapist background. And then the key contact with other services like education and care, making sure that there was consistency in terms of how the child was supported across different environments. And so, of course, we've continued to develop our understandings and ways of doing it across that range of areas. But I think it's important from my perspective to see the key worker role embedded in this team. So what do we need to do? This is a outline from an article that Susanna Gavidia-Payne recently was the lead author on. And it really steps through what we know in terms of moving from a conceptual framework through implementation to developing standards and then building the core competencies in our staff. And I think one of the questions for me is, well, we know this, but how are we actually going to progress and why is this so hard? One of the issues for me underlying where we are at the moment is we don't have a clear policy framework for children with disabilities. The policy area is almost silent on what it means for children with disabilities living in the community. The current best policies look at thinking in terms of the family, the community, the learning environment and services across the whole of those areas. We seem to be very focused on services only at the moment. I think the other thing, and it's come out in other people's presentations, is we really need to think about the key worker as a very skilled role. And one of the challenges at the moment is how do we resource the skilling up of staff to a sufficient level, and how's that paid for in the current environment? I think the complexity of implementation is a challenge, and we really need to think about the fact that the community needs to change as well as the child with a disability, and we seem to have stopped talking a lot about how that community changes. So one of my favourite quotes at the moment is from Coretta Scott King, who was the wife of Martin Luther King and a really important activist in her own right. And she talked about struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. So what was interesting in terms of freedom and the civil rights movement was it was actually the right to participate in the community on an equal basis with other people, not to be segregated or discriminated against. And I think that's still a real challenge for us as we go forward with looking at our best offer for children with disabilities and their families. So thank you very much, and back to you, Tim.
Thank you, John. It's a wonderful reminder that that last comment about the need to constantly rediscover it. And from Denise and from John and from Mary Beth, we've heard what the journey has been like. Okay, we've got 12 minutes left, so this is an opportunity to ask the panel some questions. So we've got the chat, and we've got two of our board members who have been monitoring the chat. And can I ask that Denise, you come on screen, that John, you come on screen, and Mary Beth also, and that we also have our two assistants, Paula Buttigieg and Kerry Bull, who have been monitoring the questions. So what have we got? Paula and Kerry, you've got questions that we can address to the panelists.
Tim, we haven't got questions coming up in the chat function at all, so I'd be encouraging people to put some questions in there. But I might get things started because I've got a question, particularly as a board member of Pracy, as others have too. I'm wondering, given the NDIS review and all that we've heard from the panellists today, what the participants today would like Pracy to do to support implementation of the lead practitioner role. We've put that in the chat function. We're really keen to hear from those of you here today. What would you like Pracy to do to support implementation of the lead practitioner role?
So any comments and questions from members? We'd love to hear it. Do you want us to advocate on behalf of particular issues relating to lead practitioners? Do you want us to build a set of resources and so on? Mary Beth, how have you in your role been able to support people in the field in developing these skills? You've talked a bit about this.
I wish I had a magic answer. It is getting more and more difficult. So I just want to let everybody know it's not just in Australia where it's challenging because of our funding streams. Where we've put a lot of our energy is at pre-service to try and provide funding, and our government is doing that, to higher education programs to have interdisciplinary classes together. And we have that through two mechanisms. One is the Maternal and Child Health Bureau. Remember, we talk about our foundations. They fund something called the LEND program, Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities. And there are 63 of those across the country. And by their very nature, you have to have an interdisciplinary graduate program. It's a year-long course of study. And people learn to be teams and lead teams. The other is through the OSEP, which is our government's arm for special education, where they allow pre-service programs to apply for funding to either provide programs of studies together or at least have interfacing. One of the things that we're having a big problem with state by state, so we differ across the 57 states and territories, is the fact that I fear we're losing our knowledge base of what a good team looks like, because it's being driven now by funding. As I said, we had a clarification, a team is only 2 people now. So as I said, I am looking to you guys for as much leadership as what we are struggling with in the United States. I think the really frustrating part is we know this benefits children and families, but we're not at the implementation phase. We're having a lot of problems getting that infrastructure, even when it was there 30 years ago.
Denise and John, you have any comments?
No, sorry, Tim, I was reading the comments coming through as well in the chat. So I was looking at if there was questions in there. So no, nothing to add to Mary Beth's.
There's a question coming through about this issue of families' understanding of the key worker role and how we can support families to understand that so that they're ready to be involved in that range of services.
And I think, sorry, following on from that, one comment is that one of the most significant barriers is families believing they need to see multiple disciplines and actually declining that key worker or lead practitioner service delivery model. So comments around how we get around that and support families to understand the importance.
Yeah, and thanks, Paula. I can see many of the comments there in the chat are really about support, really, to be able to have those conversations with families. But I think what we know as well is it's not just the family, it's everybody that needs to have a really good understanding, because it becomes very confusing if one person says something and somebody else says another thing. So it does need to be done across all levels. The community need to understand what this looks like. The medical area needs to understand, so that there's not the referrals for therapy that are that may be received, or more therapy. Josh, I can see you've asked about how early childhood practitioners can support families as well. So again, it's having that good understanding and having resources I can see people are asking for, so that you can easily have a conversation with families and those they're interacting with to support that decision making around the services that they receive or they apply for.
Mary Beth, have you by any chance already developed some resources we can use?
We have lots of resources up on the ECPC under cross-disciplinary, as well as under the personnel standards. We have a whole, set of resources for families, but I want to emphasize what Denise was saying, which is it's parents pick up on the ease or unease that a practitioner brings to the relationship they're building with that family. So if a practitioner is showing that they don't have the confidence or competence to do an area, let's say feeding as an example. I had a very, very concrete example the other day with one of my students who was watching a child who clearly needed some expertise from somebody who can do a good feeding program. And in the United States, that could be an occupational therapist or a speech therapist. But the primary provider, for whatever reason, was telling the parent the child really didn't need this. But then she would say things that led both my student and the family to kind of question, how was she making this? So I think, you know, to me, this whole issue of building that relationship with families and giving them, really building the trust that this model can work is having everybody meet with the family and talk about how they're sharing expertise. It doesn't mean that a different discipline can't come in when it's needed, such as for a consult. And I think that that's sometimes not explained. So families feel, justifiably so, I think, that sometimes they're getting short shrifted because they have one person who may not know how to do a certain technique. Where families, some families are very, are on the internet all the time. And they're gonna say, I wanna see this. And a practitioner just shuts them down. That doesn't create a lot of confidence. So a lot of work that we need to do to help families and practitioners understand that we are trying to build more competence for the child and for the family, and not less when we decrease the number of people coming in. But Tim, I would just say people can use our website however they can. Those case studies are really good for PD to get people to be able to cross disciplines, and there's some really good questions in there. So people can hear each other, because that's the issue. At least in the United States, we do have large caseloads in some cases, so people kind of pass in the night, so they don't really even discuss a really challenging situation. And we have to find that time, and if it takes funding, to allow people to help each other learn.
Mary Beth, ECPC stands for what? Where can people find it?
It is Early Childhood Personnel Center, and the website is ECPC. I think I have a slide. I don't want to go through and trying to find the slide. ECPC, I can put it right in the chat, ecpcta.org.
And
Thank you.
just to let people know as well, Mary Beth, with your permission, we have got a link to it from the Pracy website.
Perfect.
So if people go to
Thank
there
you.
under resources, they've got a direct link to that as well.
Paula, Kerry, other questions?
I think there's a lot of people affirming this issue of advocacy and need for resources, and someone else has suggested research, that it would be good to have Australian research to be following up from what you've been sharing with us, Mary Beth.
I think we need American research too. I mean, it's not just Australian. We don't have a lot of research. We don't have robust research on personnel and service delivery by personnel.
John and Denise, any final comments before we finish?
I go always back to the big picture. I think we also need some strong leadership statements from government, and I think that the US government does that much better than we do, though I know Mary Beth will tell me it's limited, but there's the Education Department, Health and Human Services Department's joint statement on inclusion is really miles above anything that we have here. And those things are really important because they do change the tone of the conversation in the community. And at the moment, the tone here is all about, is really pushing us back into the outpatients model, and it's not supporting the community-based model. It's not based on an understanding of early childhood development.
Yep. Denise?
I would just like to say to everybody who's put comments in the chat, thank you, because we will look at those and they will certainly give us some really good direction forward with some of the activities, resources, training, etc. that we are looking at. So really appreciate people putting those comments in.
And back to the question that Kerry posed earlier, any feedback from members as to what they would like to see Pracy doing in this space? What kind of advocacy role, what kind of resourcing role? We would love to hear from you to guide us on that. Right, we're out of time, so I want to thank Mary Beth in particular. I forgot to check what time it was where you are.
10 o'clock at night.
10 o'clock at night. So thank you very much for staying back and joining us on this webinar. Yeah, great to tap into your experience and the resources that you can share with us. Thanks also to Denise and John, and to Paula and Kerry. We hope to see many of you as possible at our conference in a couple of weeks' time, and those in Perth at Mary Louise's workshop. So thank you, and we'll finish now.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks.
Thank you all
Thanks.
very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.